All right, now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everybody see this all right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining today. Welcome to the brown bag presentation for this week. We're going to get started in just a minute here. Just want to go over some ground rules and some housekeeping. So during this meeting, please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Participants will be muted automatically as they enter, but you can unmute yourself for questions later. 1 second there. If you have any questions, raise your hand, or what we prefer for this meeting is to put any questions that you have during the meeting in the chat, and then we're going to have a Q&A section later on in the presentation. And then this is little toolbar diagrams in case you wanted to know where to type in your chat or where to raise your hand. Okay. And then we're going to do a land acknowledgement here. We acknowledge that Cal Poly Humboldt is on the land of the Wiyot peoples, which includes the Wiyot tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. Arcata is known as Gudini, meaning over in the woods or among the redwoods. Wiyot peoples continue to remain in relationship to these lands through ceremony, culture, and stewardship. And here at OLLI, we believe that learning should never end. And this is a cool picture that we took during the Trinidad Lighthouse tour hiking trip thing. It's one of our in-person classes that we had, and it was a lot of fun. Beautiful day for it too. And just a heads up to everybody who's interested in classes that the fall 2022 semester is in full swing. We have a huge lineup of classes. We have plenty more that are coming out this week, next week, and all the way through December 15th. So go ahead and register. And we do want to say that it's best to register early because some of those classes fill up really quick. And your best bet to get in the class is to sign up early. And some of classes that are coming up this week. So Friday, November 4th, that is an in-person class, tap dance. On November 1st, that's tomorrow. There's still slots open for the online guided self-massage class. And then, oops, this should be, sorry, whoops, that should be Wednesday, November 2nd, as a online class. If life gives you lemons, draw them. It's a cool little sketching class. And then Friday, November 4th also is utilizing the internet safely, recognizing fake news, and that is an in-person class. And this is a reminder, if you are not a OLLI member, it is a good idea to sign up for it. It's a membership-based program, and membership runs through July 1st through June 30th. Membership must be renewed each year for students to remain active. The price is $35 a year. And for all the classes, they're designed for lifelong learners, 50 and better. Classes are open to all learners over 18, however. And then non-members just pay an additional charge, and you're enrolled as space allows. One of the benefits of being an OLLI member is you get library access. All you need is a Cal Poly Humboldt library or ID card, which you can get through contacting the OLLI office. There's just a little form you got to fill out. And then when you have access to the library, you get, if you're an OLLI member and you're signed up for a class, you have the same access to databases and all the other resources a library has to offer, the same as a regular Cal Poly Humboldt student. And then we just want to thank all of the friends of OLLI. Thank you for the volunteers and everybody who helped make this program possible. So this is just a thank you to all of you. And without further ado, we are now starting the presentation. This is the U.S. and the Holocaust, the history and current implications with Amanda Devons. I'm going to turn it over to Jane, who's going to introduce Amanda for us. Oh, you're muted, Jane.
Okay, let me try again. I'm delighted to welcome you all to and introduce you to Amanda Devons, who has a master's in social work and has lived in Humboldt County since 1977. And she's taught in local elementary, high school, and College of the Redwoods since 1995. She's been a busy lady, and she got very interested in this particular subject. And she's going to go through and talk to you about it, and is very happy to take questions later, which you can put in the chat or just raise your hand at that time. So Amanda, it's all yours.
Okay, hello. I see these wonderful faces and I'm so happy to see you all. It's very exciting for me to do this. I must, I thank first of all, OLLI for inviting me to do this, and also Katie Whiteside, who I saw her name here. She has given me a lot of guidance, encouragement, and materials to do this presentation. And so I think I'm just going to share my screen, make sure this all works. Here we are. Okay, and then I'll turn it on to slideshow mode. Okay, so some of you have seen this show and some of you may not, but it's okay. I'm going to address it to both groups. And I got involved in this because PBS was planning to air this locally in September, and in June, an email came from KEET and Katie saying they want to have some community involvement in some classes. And she sent that email to a bunch of organizations, including Temple Bethel, of whom I'm a part. And they asked, does anybody want to teach classes on this? And since nobody else said yes, I kind of raised my hand and I said, I'll do it. Why do I think it's important that we should be interested in this? Well, especially because it has lessons on the powers of racism, on the treatment of minorities, on the rising of voices of anti-Semitism going on today, that we still have refugees as and the treatment of them as issues. And currently, as we see threats to democracy, it's all very timely. And another big concern is Holocaust denial. And so I hope you're here because you're interested in all that too. And I first of all want to say that the Holocaust was the systematic state-sponsored persecution and murder of Jews and others from 1933 to 1945 that was conducted by the Nazi Germany and its allies. And I want to also thank Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein for making this incredible series. And since I volunteered to do this, I've been immersed in reading all the materials that are on their website, on the PBS website, and other materials that I did put some references in the chat. So I want to say that the Holocaust begs us to examine certain things, and the movie series begs us to specifically examine these 4 areas. The first, how did eugenics, racism, and anti-Semitism that was percolating in the US, how did that inspire the Nazis? And how did race-based immigration quotas keep refugees out of the US, and how Holocaust information was ignored and suppressed by the press, and the role of media. And lastly, the War Refugee Board and how that was formed at the end of the war and was responsible for saving the lives of many, but at a time when most of the Jewish victims had already been murdered. So so we go to the first topic, the belief in eugenics. And what is eugenics? Eugenics is pseudoscience, but we can define it as a scientifically erroneous theory of racial improvement and planned breeding. That, just a minute, I need to move these pictures out of the way so I can see my own screen. And whoops, going back, no, going back, one more. Okay, here we are. This is a brochure from a paper that was given in a pseudo-scientific conference or the Museum of Natural History in America. Eugenics is a self-direction of human evolution. So it was seen as kind of the new and upcoming and science. Where did it start? A man named Francis Galton introduced eugenics in Britain. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin. He was also a respectable scientist that was a hereticist and studied hereditary and mathematics. And by the 1920s, it had become a global movement, fancied as a way to improve the world by what they called selective breeding. They thought of it as positive eugenics. Let the right people reproduce and the wrong people not reproduce, the wrong people being what they considered inferior or criminals or people with disabilities. And the idea came to America, and the rallying cry was, let's improve the gene pool. But quickly in America, it became negative eugenics. In other words, they were practicing sterilizing people, not just encouraging the quote right people to reproduce, but actively discouraging the people they didn't want to. So I don't know if you've heard of this man, Madison Grant, but he was the premier advocate of eugenics, and he was pretty influential in his time. He wrote a book called, here it is, The Passing of the Great Race, in 1916, that was pretty widely disseminated and quoted. And here's a quote from it. The state, through sterilization, must see to it that the line of weak or unfit stops with him, or else future generations will be cursed. Incredible to think that somebody could write that and it could be believed. But he was also a well-respected environmentalist that, amazingly, when I discovered this, wasn't in the video, but he co-founded the Save the Redwoods League. He came up to Humboldt. And so as a result of his work that also discouraged immigration, there were laws passed in 32 states to allow sterilizing people that Americans deemed unfit, and they were legally sterilized against their will with no consent. And surprisingly, shockingly, this was most popular in California.
Yeah.
80% of the sterilizations that went on in 1 year, about 20,000 of them, happened in California, mostly at state mental and hospitals and prisons. And who the
Excuse me,
people
Peggy, sorry, please mute yourself.
so not surprisingly, the people that were considered the right people were Northern Europeans, people of Germanic or Northern races. And if you look at his materials, there are charts and they divide people into racial groups, and Jews were considered a race. So let me see if I can, yes, okay. So the eugenics was embraced and disseminated in the US, and the Nazis got a hold of these ideas. There were many advocates, people that funded programs to teach it. It was taught in colleges. Roosevelt, the first Roosevelt, Alexander Graham Bell, Helen Keller, Dale Carnegie, courses, John D. Rockefeller funded it. Pretty amazing. And of course, it's not surprising that the Nazis adopted it, and they called it racial hygiene, and it backed up their thoughts about the survival of the fittest, the Aryan race that they saw as supreme, and that they wanted to dominate the world. And in Nazi Germany, there were performed right after Hitler came to power almost 1 million sterilizations, and then they quickly graduated to euthanizing. So people in mental institutions, prisons, children that were with disabilities and such that were in homes were euthanized. They were given lethal injections by medical people. And then the eugenics theories were a good justification for killing the Jews, the Romans, and other people as inferior to the master race. And so, as well as eugenics giving Nazis inspiration, the US was rife with anti-Semitism in the 20s and 30s. And some of the people mentioned in Ken Burns' series, there was Father Coughlin, that was a radio preacher that at one time had 1/3 of Americans listening to him. And he wasn't always spewing what you'd identify as hate. First, he talked about social justice, but then he formed this thing called the Christian Front, and he preached that Jews were a danger to Christians. We shouldn't let them immigrate. If Jews own businesses, they'll fire their Christian employees, etc., etc. And then there was the great American hero Charles Lindbergh, was the first pilot to go across the Atlantic, and he actually openly admired Hitler. He also thought America should stay neutral. He promoted something called America First, and he also had took lots of opportunity to blame Jews for the ills of America. And he also went to Germany and was received there. Then there was maybe the lesser known and less influential Fritz Kuhn, who formed the German-American Bund, which marched in New York City, had 20,000 people in Madison Square Gardens saying Heil Hitler and giving the Nazi salute. Pretty shocking. But the foremost of the anti-Semites was the great industrialist Henry Ford, who in Dearborn, Michigan, bought the local newspaper and used it to promote his anti-Semitic ideas. He published the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He promoted the Dearborn Independent in all his auto dealerships. They were carrying it, and when you bought a new car, you got a copy of it on your front seat. And so the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was known as a forgery, and today you call it conspiracy theory. And it was a supposed conference of Jews. It was first constructed in Russia, but saying the Jews are going to take over the world. And this caught on and was disseminated widely. And then Nazi Germany took Henry Ford's writings, they translated them into German, and the things that Henry Ford had published, he didn't always write them. And Henry Ford, unfortunately, also sold war materials to Nazi Germany. He got a medal when he visited Germany. It's a horrible, unfortunate history. And in Mein Kampf, there was one American that Hitler praised, and that was Henry Ford. So on to Hitler's Jew hatred. I wouldn't say that these American sources caused it. He had plenty of other sources, but they certainly gave him plenty of propaganda and excuse. And in Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote, "By defending myself against the Jew, I'm fighting for the work of the Lord," and thus stoking religious hatred. And I can't forget going to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. and seeing an exhibit there in which they explained that the religion of Germany, Lutheranism, was founded by Martin Luther, who wrote, "What should we do about the Jews and their lies?" Martin Luther in the 16th century wrote that we should burn all their works, burn the Talmud, and they're not worthy to live among us, and that we should throw them out of the country of Germany. So there was definitely a religious basis to appeal to, but also the racist basis. And also in Mein Kampf, he wrote, "With every means, the Jew tries to destroy the racial foundations of the German people." In other words, he won't let the Aryan race be. They're a threat against the Aryan race, and Hitler said over and over again, "The Jews are our misfortune." Here's a cartoon from that time. Translated, it says, "The Jew will end, the fight goes on." And you can see the stereotypical picture, the hook-nosed Jew and the Aryan who's going to win. And so shortly after Hitler took dictatorial powers in 1933, he passed the Nuremberg laws that were all about blood and who has which blood. It was very reminiscent of Madison Grant's book. He banned intermarriage in the Nuremberg laws. He determined who was a Jew and defined it by how many grandparents you had. And then they went on, they boycotted Jewish businesses. They made life really, really hard. And the original intent was to make all the Jews leave Germany, and many of them did. But here we are back in the US, and we're going to examine race-based immigration quotas. And it set the stage for our response to the Holocaust. Was the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which made what they thought would be permanent race-based quotas for immigration. In other words, they were going to limit the number of immigrants, and they were going to base it on their country of origin. And prior to this, from the 1880s to the 1920s, there were great waves of immigration. And here we see that before that, most of the immigrants were coming from England and Ireland, from Northwest Europe. But as new immigrants came, they came from the Southern Europe, like Italy, the Eastern Europe, they came from Poland and Russia. This was the years of the great melting pot. And so America changed in its racial nature, in its white Anglo-Saxon dominance. And so the Johnson-Reed Act was trying to turn that back, and so they limited the quota of immigrants based on on where people were born in 1890. So they wanted to return to that ethnic mix. And what they achieved was an 80% reduction in the total number of immigrants. From, you can see the 1921 to the 1925 figures. But not only were the total immigrants limited, the number of Jews that were allowed in became a small fraction of what had come previously. So this was overwhelmingly passed and approved of. The country was very anti-immigration, and not only did the Ku Klux Klan and such approve of this, but the AFL, the labor unions, approved of it because they were afraid that immigrants would take over American jobs. And this was a big concern in the Depression years. So Hitler learned about American immigration policies, and he was pleased. So fast forward to 1939, and by that time, there was a 10-year waiting list for Jewish applicants because they were only granted 27,000 visas, of which a lot of them even went unissued, but 139,000 at least were on the waiting list for visas to come to America. And it was a 10-year waiting list. And while that was going on, hundreds of bills were introduced and passed to decrease immigration. They made increased obstacles to get into the United States, and no exception for refugees. And the immigrants, meanwhile, had no jobs. They had no citizenship. They were refused entry because, quote, they might be spies. And because they had no property, they couldn't prove that they weren't going to be a burden. And this was all popular with Americans because 72% of Americans, when polled, said no more refugees, even after Kristallnacht, which was the turning point when life was definitely unbearable for Jews anymore. And what about FDR? He was largely silent in all that, or he said he had no power to change Congress. So but under the pressure to change immigration, FDR convened the Evian Conference in France, where 32 delegates from 32 countries came, and Roosevelt was hoping that some other countries would open themselves up to refugees, maybe South America. And as the Nuremberg laws have been passed and Jews had no rights, a lot of them had left, but there was still hundreds of thousands of Jews left. And then Hitler annexed Austria in the Anschluss, and 200,000 more Jews became under Hitler's grasp. And so what happened in this conference? One by one, the delegates from the countries expressed great sympathy, but one by one, they said, we can't let them in. Canada said letting in one refugee would be too many. Pretty shocking. I think some made it to Canada anyway. Australia made a commitment for 15,000 Jews over 3 years. The US said they didn't want to start or incite a Jewish problem. And there was one exception. One country was an exception, and that was, surprisingly maybe, the Dominican Republic. They said they'd taken 100,000 refugees. Why? Because a man named Trujillo was a dictator, and he was trying to get rid of all the Haitian immigrants in the Dominican Republic, and he wanted to bring in some white Europeans and to farm some land in the Dominican Republic, and a few hundred actually made it. There's a quote by Chaim Weizmann. He said, "The world is divided into two places, those where Jews couldn't live and places where Jews could not enter." And as you can see, they were left at the mercy of the Third Reich, which had taken over by this time much of Europe. And the only other hope was, at that point, was England. Then there was the voyage of the St. Louis, and that ship sailed to Cuba with 936 desperate passengers, which they had Cuban visas, but they were faked by a corrupt official. Cuba wouldn't let them in, and then they sailed away from Cuba after a few days and came in view of Miami. They could see the lights, and the Coast Guard was trailing the ship, making sure that nobody jumped overseas. And some of the passengers appealed to the State Department, who said they'd have to go on the waiting list. FDR was cabled, no reply. So after several days of hopeless negotiations, they were turned back to Europe, and England, France, Belgium, and Holland agreed to take them in, but those countries also were overrun by Nazis, and almost a third of the ship was later murdered in the Holocaust. But then there was the Wagner-Rogers bill to save 20,000 child refugees. It was modeled on the kinder transport that took 10,000 children to England, not their parents, just the children, and the very brave parents, most of whom would never see their children again. So, but the lives of the children were saved. So a Democrat and a Republican got together and introduced this bill, but it was It was stalled in Congress. It was opposed. The American public opposed it. It never came to a vote because they felt that if they pressed it too hard, they'd further restrict immigration. And who was the person in the State Department that was supervising the issue of visas during the war? Well, it was this man, Breckinridge Long, an appointee of FDR, and he was quoted as saying that he was going to make sure that the minimum number of refugees could come. He was going to postpone the granting of visas. He put every obstacle he could think of in the way. Like, he said that if there were if the refugee had any relatives living in Nazi occupied territories, they couldn't come because they could get blackmailed, or they could grant favors to the Nazis and they'd be spies. As a result, immigration was slashed in half. And in this chart, you can see that in 1933, the quota this is the German quota, which was virtually all Jews. It was 5% filled. And during the 1934 to 1937, there was some increase until right before America entered the war, it became 100% filled, the quota for Germans. But then during the war, it went down again. It was only 8% of the quota was filled. But while the quota was filled and people were on the waiting list, they never shifted any quotas from any other countries. Like England, they weren't filling their quota. People weren't trying to get out of England then. I think I may have skipped something, but that's okay. We'll go on to the media coverage during that time. So here's some headlines. It shows that Americans did know what the Nazis were doing. There's a myth that they didn't, but it was widely publicized. There were thousands of articles, starting in 1933 with the Nuremberg laws. Americans did know, and sometimes they protested, but sometimes the news was denied. And this is where we see shades of what's going on today. The actions were sometimes condemned in the press and sometimes not. There was a bright spot with a woman named Dorothy Thompson, who was married to Sinclair Lewis, the novelist, and she reported on fascism from Germany. She went into Germany and she gave some very negative firsthand accounts until they threw her out. But she had a beautiful quote. She said, for thousands of people, a piece of paper is the only difference between life and death. A piece of paper with a stamp on it. But also a little infamous in that time was the New York Times, because it was a Jewish-owned paper run by owned by Arthur Sulzberger, a German Jew. And of the thousands of stories that were in the New York Times about World War II, there were very, very few about the Holocaust. Of 12,000 front page stories, only 26 mentioned the Holocaust. And even when news about the final solution came out, it was buried on page 10 next to some ads and a wedding announcement. And recently there's been a book called Buried by the Times that somebody wrote. So the feeling was that the Jews themselves were very afraid of arousing anti-Semitism. And FDR played into this. He made great pains to avoid mentioning Jews when he talked about victims of the war. And 2/3 of Americans actually blamed the Jews for their own persecution when polls came out. And you can see how an anti-Semitic environment could encourage that. How about FDR himself? He was an extremely popular president, elected 4 times, got overwhelming support from Jews who gave him 82, 85, and then 90% of their vote, and very popular as the man that fought the Nazis and won the war, as well as putting an end to the Great Depression. But by the New Deal, FDR was ridiculed by non-Jews as having the Jew deal, or sometimes they called him Rosenfeld instead of Roosevelt. So I think he may have been sensitive to that. But early on in the war, before the war, FDR welcomed Nazi warships to the US. So there is quite a debate about anti-Semitism of FDR. Was he acting out of political expedience? Was he callous? Was he anti-Semitic? There's plenty of evidence. Rabbi Stephen Wise was the foremost spokesman for the Jewish community at that point, and he met with FDR. He begged for action on immigration. There was talk about bombing Auschwitz, or bombing the railway lines leading to Auschwitz. And FDR promised punishment for the Nazis, but he said it wasn't feasible to do anything else. It's debatable because there was bombing going on 5 miles away from there. We can discuss that later. A very heroic man named Jan Karski was a Polish partisan. He was an eyewitness to the Holocaust, and he met with FDR. He came to America and he gave a firsthand account, and apparently FDR said nothing and changed the subject. So the record is controversial. But then there was another conference convened, the Bermuda Conference, to solve the plight of refugees in Europe, and Britain and America co-sponsored that. And basically what they did was they agreed between them they would win the war. That's the best way to save the Jews, but the Americans were not to mention anything about the British not allowing Jews into Palestine and blockading that. And the British were not allowed to bring up American quotas and limited refugee numbers. Then we're going to go on to the Regner telegram, what was known. It was, this was a telegram from a man named Gerhard Regner that was the head of the World Jewish Congress in Europe. And he sent it to World Jewish Congress members in New York and London. including Rabbi Stephen Weiss, but the State Department blocked it, and first of all, from getting into Weiss's hands, and then they said it was a war rumor, possibly false rumors or fake news, and Weiss, Rabbi Weiss did get the same message from contacts in Great Britain eventually, but then it was that news of the plan of Hitler's to exterminate at one fell swoop all the Jews in German-controlled country, 3.5 to 4 million Jews after deportation to the East, where they discussed methods of killing all the Jews. That was like published there. That was published, a known facts now, the final solution. But the news of it was held up, it was suppressed, and Rabbi Weiss was pressured to persuade other Jewish leaders to keep their silence, because they felt that if it was publicized in the US, that there could be reprisals in Germany, there could be an anti-Semitic backlash in the US, or American soldiers would refuse to fight to save Jews. And so for those reasons, they didn't want the news of the Holocaust to get out. So the last of the 4 topics in US and the Holocaust was how the War Refugee Board was formed. And this was later on in the war, when actually most of the victims of the Holocaust had already been killed on the Eastern Front. First of all, by bullets when the Nazis invaded Germany, but later on, 90% of the Polish Jews have been killed. There were 3 million Polish Jews before the war. 90% of them were sent to concentration camps and murdered. But Peter Bergson was an activist, and he came to America from Palestine, where he was known as Hillel Cook. He was the nephew of the chief rabbi. He had lots of connections. He wasn't a religious man, but he knew lots of Orthodox Jews, and he spoke Yiddish. And he formed the Bergson group, and it was very active, and it did things that the establishment did not really approve of. He took out hundreds of newspaper ads begging for help in the name of the victims of the Holocaust, full-page ads. And his activities did lead to the formation of the War Refugee Board, and you can watch this terrific documentary by Pierre Savage called Not Idly By. I highly recommend it. But 2 other things he did, the Bergson group, he put on a pageant in March of 1943 called We Will Never Die. And he had Ben Hecht, Paul Muni, people well known in Hollywood. Kurt Weill, himself a refugee, composed this. It was kind of like a big musical in the voice of the dead of Europe. And he filled Madison Square Gardens twice. And then it went on tour through America, a big, spectacular pageant. Eleanor Roosevelt saw it, and it was getting publicity. But later that year, in October, they organized 400 rabbis to march on Washington, the Rabbis' March. And though all kinds of rabbis were invited, who showed up were mostly Orthodox, very religious rabbis that probably weren't so afraid of the anti-Semitic backlash. They were in their own world and they didn't care. And so they marched to the Capitol. They said some prayers. They prayed in Hebrew. They said the Kaddish. I looked and looked, but I couldn't find a video of much of this, just a few seconds. And as they approached the Capitol building, and the vice president came out, and they presented him with a petition, and they read it in English and Hebrew, and they asked that a government commission be formed to look into rescuing the remaining European Jews, and that America should increase its quota for refugees. And Wallace said a few polite words, and then they went and they asked to see Roosevelt. But meanwhile, he was being whisked out the back door. He was advised not to see these kind of people. And however, because Roosevelt snubbed the Jews, it got a lot of press and some headlines, and there was a bit of an outcry, and it led to a hearing on what the State Department was doing for refugees. And they asked Breckinridge Long, the person that gave out the visas, they asked him to prepare a report. And he prepared a report where he greatly exaggerated the number of refugees. He said there were 650,000 that America had brought in. And then Roosevelt's friend, Henry Morgenthau, that was the Secretary of the Treasury, he saw those statistics. He saw the number of lies, and they put out a stinging report that said, that was called Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews. And they exposed the obstruction. And Breckinridge Long was relieved of his duties. And as a direct result, Roosevelt got involved, and they, whoops, wrong direction. There we are. And they formed the War Refugee Board. It was pretty close to the end of the war, but it was unique in American history because it was the only time when the US government founded a non-military agency during a war to save the lives of civilians. So they didn't fund it. It was mostly funded by private Jewish organizations, but it was a US government organization. And they funded the work of Raoul Wallenberg. At this time, the only country that had still got a sizable Jewish population was Hungary. And Wallenberg was a Swedish businessman that went to Budapest and issued thousands of visas for them to immigrate to Sweden. It's estimated he saved 200,000 Hungarian Jews. And the War Refugee Board also bought, this is the only time that refugees were actually brought to America. There was a group of 982 Jews brought to abandoned military installment in Fort Ontario, New York. That was in June 1944. So Eleanor Roosevelt was a great supporter of these activities, although not so much her husband. And finally, I'm going to end with a quote of Ken Burns right here. when we ask, what was the US responsible for? Did it cause the Holocaust? Absolutely not. The Americans fought the war that over Nazi Germany and won. They won the war, but unfortunately, Nazi Germany was defeated in the war on America and the Allies, but it wasn't defeated in its war on the Jews because they managed to destroy 2/3 of European Jews and murder them. But as Ken Burns said, we rightly celebrate American ideals of democracy and our history as a nation of immigrants. But American institutions like segregation and brutal treatment of natives and anti-Semitism and racism were influential in Hitler's Germany. And furthermore, as the Nazi terror escalated, the US responded by tightening, not opening its borders to refugees. And that was Ken Burns inviting us to look at our policies. Are we going to be a nation that says, exemplifies, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door, written by a woman who herself was an immigrant. And those words from her poem were the words of the 3 different episodes of Ken Burns' documentary and the 3 different time periods. So unfortunately, the US was willing to open its doors to only a fraction of the hundreds of thousands of people seeking refuge from Nazi Germany, including those that could have rightfully come under the quota system. So I'd like to ask the question that Sam Allen, the wonderful professor from HSU, asked. How do we become a nation of rescuers and not bystanders when we're confronted with enormous evil? And thank you so much for listening, for pondering, for seeing the original documentary. You can write in the chat if you saw it, if you'd like, or any questions in the chat. And I'm going to stop sharing and see if you have any questions. You can comments or reactions.
Amanda, there are several comments in the chat. Was the early 20th limit on Jews a side effect of the change in allowed geographical regions alone, or was it overtly done to bar Jews by religion directly?
Okay, good question. They were not barred by religion. There was no Jewish quota on immigration, but the countries from which the Jews had immigrated from, like Eastern Europe, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, their numbers were decreased significantly.
And they moved to the northern European countries, basically. You indicated that FDR welcomed Nazi warships to the US. Do you recall when that was, and why would he do that?
That was before America had entered the war from 1933 to 1938. And at that time, there was trade going on. Henry Ford was supplying trucks for the Nazis. I don't know if the word warships is correct, but they were supplying munitions and trading with Germany.
Huh. And then I don't see her here. It says, is Lynn McKenna a plant? She is sweeping her kitchen floor on the phone and texting, distracting. I don't even see her here. Oh, well. Did Ken Burns address the many Jews who were able to immigrate through Hong Kong from Australia?
From
From Austria, pardon
from
me.
China? Is he talking about Shanghai? There was,
He says through Hong Kong from Austria.
now I know about the Jews that were able to get to Shanghai, that took in tens of thousands, but I don't know. Can Sherman, can you unmute yourself? And
I meant Shanghai. We saw a display of this in a museum up in Vancouver. It was a Chinese museum, and they had displays about the Jewish tribes that live outside in China and also the immigration from Austria.
yes, I've heard that they got an amazing welcome in China, and it was maybe an example of a more open society, ironically. And did you say they went from Austria to?
Yeah,
Not from
that's what
Austria.
I found. I believe there was some consul or ambassador back in Europe who was able to write them papers to get out. He was willing to do that.
And where did most of those people eventually, did they eventually come to the United States?
I don't know the answer to that. The display was emphasizing the Chinese aspect.
Yes, they were a good example of hospitality. Let's see what else is in the chat.
I think Nancy has a question.
I have a question because I so enjoyed the whole documentary by Ken Burns. Was there any backlash from any segment of our present country for that series? Was there any, this is a lie, this is a denial kind of situation, or has it been well accepted as the truth?
That's a very good question, and I don't know the answer because of in the Holocaust denial circles. I never looked that up or heard about it. But I know that his documentary was widely praised by articles in the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Atlantic. And then there was a little bit of controversy by a man that named Raphael Medoff, that is the head of the David Wyman Institute of Holocaust Studies. And the controversy was about the role of Roosevelt. So these are people that are not Holocaust deniers, but they're kind of, they're reevaluating history. And some historians think that Roosevelt was treated too kindly by Ken Burns. And they brought up a number of instances of Roosevelt's own anti-Semitism. For instance, Roosevelt said at one point privately that no wonder the Germans don't like the Jews. 50% of the German doctors and lawyers are Jews. And that wasn't even true. That was a gross exaggeration, like maybe 10%, but when they were 1% of the population. So that was a little bit of controversy. But as far as in the white supremacist press, I don't know if any of those would take the time to watch a 6-hour series. I hope they would. Has anybody I'd like to hear some reactions from other people and other parts of the series they felt were notable, or anything new that you learned. Did people feel that they learned a lot of new information, or was it mostly stuff they knew already?
Don't be afraid to comment.
Oh, so
You're getting signs of appreciation from people.
uh,
A thing that's mystified me for forever is what the basis for this attitude is. Because the only thing I can go back to is the foundations of Christianity and the the attitudes toward Jesus. So it's very hard for me to understand where this negative bias and then discrimination comes from. They never talk about why it occurs.
why anti-Semitism?
Why anti-Semitism? What
Yes.
is the basis for it? That it's just very hard to understand because it's so pervasive and it seems to be so easy to create and spread.
Well, it's probably, I would say, the most virulent forms of anti-Semitism has occurred in Christian countries. And so your theory probably could gather a lot of evidence. Although anti-Semitism certainly predated Christianity, because the Persians and the Romans and the Greeks all had their own version of it. In more recent times, it was seen in its worst forms in Europe, in Spain with the Inquisition, with the Crusades, and then with the pogroms of Europe and the Holocaust. And why would it have such a fertile ground in all those places? Well, I think that when Jews are painted as Christ killers, and even though there's been apologies for that and people have said they've not, and it seems like a ridiculous accusation, it certainly can be an excuse for somebody that has hatred that they're looking to justify, that they killed God. Like the poet said, how I'll think of that poem later, but the Jews have been criticized and blamed for capitalism, and they've been blamed for communism. They've been attacked because they were poor, and they've been attacked because they were too rich. And I think there is sort of some sort of jealousy involved. And also people have probed what informed Hitler's anti-Semitism. And he wrote about the Jews introduced a conscience to the world that wasn't there before. He actually wrote this, that he would rather go back to paganism where there was no conscience. And the Jews, through their ethical teachings and laws, did promote monotheism and a relationship with God that was highly ethical, and just a hypothesis that people could have thought similarly to Hitler, that they didn't need that kind of interference in their thoughts and lives.
That's a fascinating concept. That's not one I've heard before.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite interesting.
I'd like to add to that, if I might.
Molly, yeah.
The fourth gospel of John is notably anti-Semitic. On the other three are not so much. And scholars that I follow talk about the fact that as these books were later and later in writing, they were being written within the framework of the Roman Empire, which was itself anti-Semitic. And so to get something out there, printed, published, more and more writers were just collapsing into the anti-Semitism of the time to get their words out there. And so that fourth gospel seems to have fallen into that very, very strongly, where it completely changes the blaming, if you will, in a very strong way. Though the Sanhedrin was always implicated in the earlier gospels, it became very, very strong in the Gospel of John that it could be read without any difficulty at all that he was blaming the fellow Jews of this person as responsible. So that piece goes down in history through the Roman Empire, which becomes the Holy Roman Empire, which becomes the Roman Catholic Church. This is a through line that's very unfortunate. Thank you.
And so thank you for that. And so fast forward to today. So now in a new outbreak of anti-Semitism is going on, and this phrase, the synagogue of Satan, has anyone ever heard of that? That's right out of it's out of the Gospels, and it's also part of the book of Revelation. It talks about the synagogue of Satan and those who say they are Jews and are not. So not only have Jews tried to be destroyed for who they are, that's like saying you're not really Jews, and that's the latest morphing of this ideology. You're not really Jews. You're not even the real Jews. You know, we're the real Jews. So there's that also comes from a biblical source, and so
Molly, Kate added that race-based closure of U.S. immigration included the earlier 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. I mean, it's not that we haven't done it before. And you have to put all the attempts to stop immigration and credit it in part to the Depression, because so many people were out of work. The last thing they wanted to do is have more immigrants in that might be challenging their jobs. So what jobs were available. So that it's useful to have a historical context. It's no excuse, and it's no excuse what the head of the State Department did for 4 or 5 years before they, and it's amazing that nobody figured out what he was doing. Obviously, it was
some silent complicity.
Yeah, silent complicity.
But there was also that 1924 bill to limit immigration. It completely excluded any Asians. And now the Japanese were excluded, and it excluded anybody from Africa. So it basically just limited it to Europeans, but basically Northern Europeans, like the British and the Irish. So it was now the immigration quotas. Well, they got that act was in force till 1952, when they formed a more merit-based type of immigration law. But I wanted to mention that about sterilization and eugenics, that there is a law that the Supreme Court passed that has not yet been overturned that legalized sterilization. So it was in 1927, the Bush versus Bell Act. So it was still going on till recently. And another another outcome from eugenics laws was the anti-miscegenation laws that were ended with Amanda the Loving versus Virginia, when the Supreme Court made it illegal to ban interracial marriage. But Hitler took great note of that, and he based his race and marriage and immigration laws were very much based on the American laws that were being passed. And he said so.
Molly Kate comments, this series was useful by strongly affirming the truth, but it's also very easy to see so many analogies, the process that they went through and the process we're potentially going through, and making you think about what's going on in this country. I don't think we've always talked about the horrors of what went on in Germany and Europe. We've not, and until this series, we weren't looking at what the US's role was and how we reacted and failed to react. And why, it's in the context of the Depression, it's more understandable, but at the same time, it's not. So many of the things we do are in violation of our alleged Christian ethics.
Yes, and concepts such as like fake news and failure to condemn things that are acts of violence is still very relevant today. And our reaction to evil, very relevant. People laugh at people getting tortured and persecuted, or they stay silent, and it speaks a lot. It gives permission to perpetrators. In some people's view, there are no bystanders. There are victims and oppressors. And watching Ken Burns' documentary also brings up thoughts about the power of one person for good or evil, how one person can terrorize the world, or one person can put a stop to it. And there are different theories about this. Some people think it's not really the person, it's the whole country, and some people think, well, what would have happened if Hitler hadn't been born, and etc. So it's very challenging, and also in light of what's going on with the invasion of the Ukraine today. And it's challenging me to think about that and my response to that.
Are there any other questions? I haven't seen anything more in the chat. Let's see. Thank you so much for this. Always disturbing to see the parallels to current time from leaders and followers and media versions of, quote, reality, even though some, quote, religious, quote, leaders, and the blame factor and so much more. And then Living the Good Life, author and national sensation in the 1920s, Scott Nearing, was also a eugenics enthusiast. Kanye West is likely the most famous US citizen who is favorably referred to anti-Semitism today. And yes, Sherman, his statement, Sherman commented that when I asked the question, why did this happen to the Jews, Sherman responded, the Jews killed Jesus. And so Gerald Lynn responded, yes, Sherman, his statement offers the opportunity to see how companies, political and famous people respond to over
Anti-Semitism. Sorry.
Okay, sorry about that. I mean, I don't know how many of you have actually watched this series. I'd be curious to know how many of you have seen it. Has pretty much everybody seen it?
maybe they could, some people are, the pictures don't show, so maybe somebody could put one of those icons like a thumbs up in the chat if you've seen it.
Yeah, can you do that? Go over and go to reactions, and if you've seen it, raise your hand.
When you say it, what is it?
If you've seen the series, Ken Burns' series on the Holocaust, raise your hand.
I keep raising my hand, but I can't. I'm blocked out.
Go down to reactions at the base and go down to either thumbs up or clap or lower your hand, either take your pick if you've seen it already. So it would appear that not many of you have seen it. It's highly worth watching. I'm sure it will be on again on KEET. If you have password, if you're a member of KEET for over $60 a year, you have access to password.
Passport.
Pardon me, not password, passport. And can probably watch the series there. It's a fabulous series. It forces you to look at what went on, our role in it, and draw analogies to what is going on in the United States and what we need to be aware of and the dangers of it. So it's a wonderful series. He called it his best work ever, most important work effort ever. And I'm sure that's the result of the analogies he sees of what's going on in the United States today. So any more comments here? She put a list of resources from Amanda in the chat. They will be, I believe, also on a slide, so you can later go back and watch this. But I highly recommend that you watch this series. It's very thought-provoking, anxiety-provoking. Just what we need is more anxiety. But the elections will be over soon. Kay said she only saw one of them. She'll catch up. Molly, thank you, Amanda. We all thank you so very much for joining us today. And I want to tell you that on November 7th, the day before the election, will be a presentation on the transition to life plan community living by Voices of Experience. And Lindsay will be presenting. She will be giving an update on the Life Plan Humboldt project and learn about the transition from a traditional home into a planned community. She'll be having people talk about their experiences in making that transition, if you're considering doing something like that, and what's engaged and what's involved, and how the challenges and the rewards. So we thank you so much for coming today, and we thank Amanda for doing all this work and putting this together for us. Feel free to go and not only watch the series, but look at the various, what are they? There's a whole slew of URLs you can go to learn more about it. So thank you so ever so much.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda.
See you at OLLI soon.
And then I have one more announcement to make. It's regarding OLLI classes for this upcoming week and next week. Molly Kate is in the class. She is one of our instructors for Women Who Inspire, which is coming up on Wednesday. It's going to be Wednesday, November 2nd through the 16th, and that's going to be at 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. So if that seems like a class that interests you, Molly would love to have you there. And yeah, there's plenty more classes that are looking for enrollment on our catalog. So check that out. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you, Amanda, for that wonderful presentation.
And Dane, there's another one on Tuesday from 10 to 12. David Marshak is going to have a course on Have Boomers Betrayed America?
Yep. Tuesday.
Great. So don't forget about that either. You can still sign up for it. It's $20. It's online.
Yeah.
So you don't have to go to going personal. So thank you ever so much, everybody. And thank you in particular, Amanda. Great bit of work you've done on this.
Been a
We
pleasure.
appreciate it.